Welcome to the Library Podcast. My name is Kim. In this episode, we are going to be spending some time with poetry. Anne-Marie and Fred stopped by the Marmora and Lake Public Library to join me in a discussion on why poetry matters and why some people seem to be a little afraid of it. So in April, the library held a poetry tea to invite people to share original poems or their favorite poems or just to come and listen. And I found that when I would share the news of the poetry tea, sometimes I would get grimaces back. And I'm wondering if Anne-Marie and Fred have any ideas as to why people feel disconnected from poetry now.
It may have been what they were forced to read in high school. I don't know, My Last Duchess by Browning or something like that. But most people don't realize that they do love poetry. They love poetry in songs. Like if they like Leonard Cohen, they love poetry. It's like Bob Dylan, they love poetry, and Patti Smith, and we can go on and on and on. I think music is songs are a good entry point to poetry.
So as a former high school English teacher, I would love to sit here and say that when I started the unit on poetry, I would read poetry to the class, and they would listen attentively, and maybe sometimes a few tears roll down their cheeks as they are moved by the imagery and diction of the poems. But of course that did not happen. But instead I did what most English teachers do in high school, is I went step by step through a poem with them to start, and then other poems they did themselves, and dissected it word by word, almost like a science experiment. And I know it seems like ghastly that I did that, but what came out of it was all of a sudden the poem became approachable to them, because now they understood it. Because when your mind, I think, is just shut off, like, I'm not going to understand it. It's like someone saying to me, read that physics textbook over there, Anne-Marie. Like, go ahead, here it is, clunk and plunk it in front of me. My brain's going to go just into darkness, because I'm going to be like, I can't understand it. But if someone tutored me and went step by step through the book, I'd have a chance at possibly understanding these concepts that seem beyond me before I've even opened the book. And I think I have to remember that for some people, that's poetry. Mm-hmm. You're going to put a poem in front of someone and their mind is going to go blank. It's just going to be darkness. Like, no, I can't understand it. It's beyond me. But when you go step by step, and this is what happened when I did it with my students, and I would choose poetry that I felt they could connect to. So that was something I was very cognizant of. And so what I found was that once they understood the poem, then they could make that personal connection to it. And it was almost like a little bit of an aha moment. Not for all of them, I'll say some of them. But I think that is the part of the puzzle is, how do we make it more approachable to everyone, to the masses, and for people not to have this fear of poetry, and like you said, like to be so disconnected from it.
To grimace.
And I wanted to share something that idea of when someone says, ugh, I hate poetry. And as someone who I enjoy writing poetry, usually I'm like, like I don't know what to say. And when we were at the poetry tea, we sat with a poet from Madoc, and she was talking about how poetry is unsafe. And I thought to myself, I like that. So I was thinking that the next time someone rolls their eyes or goes, oh, I hate poetry, I'm going to lean in and whisper, poetry is unsafe. Because I think that's very intriguing, and it would be interesting to see how they react. And I found a really good quote I won't remember this quote to tell them, but it's by Alice Walker. And she wrote, "Poetry is the lifeblood of rebellion, revolution, and the raising of consciousness." So that's pretty powerful. And I think that had I thought of this when I was a teacher back in my previous life, I think that would have been a really intriguing angle, because that's what adolescence is about, rebellion. So I think that that would have really appealed to them.
Yes.
That is a great response. What are some poems or poets you might recommend for helping people maybe start to get into poetry if they've never really read it, or it was a long time ago and they have bad memories?
Well, I guess I used to say that Oscar Wilde was my favorite poet, and that's because I really enjoy the Ballad of Reading Gaol. But truth be told, I do think that his plays are superior to most of his poems. But that's my problem, is I get so fascinated with the lives of people I like to read about or read. And so Oscar Wilde's biographies really intrigue me. And I read Keats' biographies long before I read any Keats. I even had a poster of Keats up on my wall, but I didn't read his poetry. However, I did get into it a little bit through an Anthony Burgess novel from the late 70s called ABBA, ABBA. And it was about Keats' last few months in Italy, dying of tuberculosis. And to amuse himself, he attempted to translate very smutty poetry by an Italian poet. And I found that very intriguing. It was an interesting aspect to Keats that I hadn't thought about, but of course, it's purely fictional. So, yeah. And then other than that, my love of poetry is really through music. And I think Bob Dylan, really, and it is rebellious. Masters of War, come on. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say. My favorite. Take out the.
I think for me it would be, I would recommend Dorothy Parker, because she is so humorous in her poetry. And of course, Emily Dickinson, I love her. And for me, I love Sylvia Plath, but she's pretty heavy, that angst poetry, which is what I'm very attracted to. But I know that's not for everyone. But those would be 3 poets I would recommend.
Those are great recommendations. So lastly, do you have any advice or thoughts on having people attempt or start to write their own poetry and why it's something worth doing?
Well, now we did this in our writers group. We decided to all experiment with writing haiku to begin with. And that's a really low commitment thing. I mean, it's just 3 lines, and you can have a lot of fun with it. So I surprised myself by writing the first poetry I had in 50 years since high school. Wrote 3 haiku, and I've been having fun with it ever since, trying to do the various exercises the writers group is attempting. So yeah, now I'm committed. Now maybe I'll read some Keats. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, it has been fun being in writers group and seeing people who are amazing writers start by saying, well, I don't write poetry, or I'm not interested in that. And then they do it and they are like, it's so much fun. Like that's, and I remember, Fred, you read a poem that you wrote when you were a teenager that you found.
Very last one. Yeah.
And look at how well received it was. Everyone loved it and they were laughing and it was great. It was really fun to watch that happen. And I think the key is to just give it a try. But I think the issue is it's scary because it feels so vulnerable to put your deepest feelings on paper and then maybe share it. And I think everyone has to remember they don't have to share it, but the beauty of sharing it, the ultimate outcome would be that if the person listening it or reading it doesn't feel as alone. Because it's so, sometimes we have all these deep, deep feelings and fears and anxieties. And then as soon as we can see that, oh, someone else feels that same way, then we get that connection and we just feel less alone with it.
So just another question that follows up on that a little bit is, when you're working on a poem, do you approach it differently than when, let's say, you were writing a short story, in that maybe you're giving a little more attention to how the poem sounds when it's read aloud?
Well, definitely, especially with a haiku where you're really constrained by the number of syllables. So I can go over a line over and over again to get both the right sound and the right number of syllables. So yes, very much more.
Definitely. So when I first write a poem, I don't read it out loud. I just get it all down. I get it all down, all my thoughts down. And then I go back and I read it out loud. And that's when the real work happens. Because I've even found sometimes just by switching 2 words around, it changes the whole rhythm of the line. And just, I don't know. Yes, reading out loud is so important, more so than with short stories. I would definitely say, even though I do read it out loud, but later on in the process. Where with poetry, it's really after I get all of my thoughts down, and that's when I go in and I tweak. And man, it can make such a difference.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much for spending your time, and I hope that Fred and Anne-Marie have encouraged listeners to pick up some poems to read and to write their own. Anne-Marie will be reading her poem, At Last, which describes the process she goes through when writing poetry. It is essentially a poem about a poem within a poem.
At last. Tentatively, words come, rounded and soft, layering across the lines. On the horizon, contours of clouds unveil a variegated blue silk sky. Quick silver summits inspire the spirit of the feather, shaping a sacred land never traversed before. At last, there it is. The spasm of fear spilling cold tea from my mother's cup, the strain of perfection exhuming a warren of woes. Will my poem be good enough?
Thank you for that wonderful poem, Anne-Marie. That brings us to the end of this edition of To the Library podcast. Big thanks again to Anne-Marie and Fred for stopping by the library to discuss poetry. To the Library podcast is produced by the Marmora and Lake Public Library. Some of the poetry recommendations that you heard in this episode are Anthony Burgess's ABBA, ABBA, the poetry of Dorothy Parker, the poetry of Emily Dickinson, and the poetry of Sylvia Plath. Until next time, keep reading!